local residents became alarmed by the smells. Led by chemist Bruce Dearden, they've started to take samples for themselves. They're worried their country brook is being contaminated. They know waste like PCBs can cause cancer, poison watercourses, and decimate wildlife.
Just smell that.
What was your reaction when you discovered there was PCBs in this water?
Absolutely outraged. This thing just shouldn't happen in Great Britain. I think that gradually the UK is becoming the sort of dumping ground of the world because of our laws. People are just allowed to use this place as a dumping ground. That's just the way I feel about it.
Bruce Dearden's samples of mud from the stream underwent sophisticated analysis at Queen Mary College London by scientist Dr. Paul Johnson. His work there is funded by the environmental group Greenpeace. He holds a post as an honorary lecturer in biological sciences and is now having his results confirmed by an independent lab.
We analysed this sediment sample by a standard method of solvent extraction, and we have found surprisingly high levels, or what appear to be surprisingly high levels of PCBs. We're certainly not used to being able to isolate them in such quantity and quite so readily from environmental samples, and that's indicative of a really quite considerable contamination, a pollution problem indeed, in the area.
The residents' findings have now also been confirmed by the local borough council. Official sampling at 3 points in the stream was organised by Environmental Health Officer Robert Floyd.
The third sampling point closest to the tip, the levels are significantly higher, and if there was regular contact with the water there, they could pose a significant risk to public health.
In fact, the council have known about the leak since 1984, but as they wrote to residents this year, to make the tip safe would have cost £1 million, £1 million they didn't have. Therefore, no effective practical remedy could be found.
It's not all right to leave it as it is. That would be an act of grave irresponsibility in environmental terms. What has been going on, in fact, over the past number of years could be really described best as an act of environmental vandalism, a really sort of a lackadaisical attitude to environmental values.
Alvanley Tip is a sorry story. So far, no one is prepared even to test the local cattle for contamination that could pass into the food chain. These forgotten tips reveal the legacy of the past when there were no legal controls.
20 years ago, before there was any legislation, what was toxic waste disposal like here?
Simply a question of finding a man with a lorry who knew of a hole in the ground.
There was one such man in those days with a lorry, a fleet of lorries, and back in 1973, this week exposed just how his company, Pearl Waste, went about dumping toxic material. He was dubbed the Elegant Muck Shifter. His name was Tony Morgan. He even had one of his laboratories opened by Cabinet Minister Peter Walker. Such was his rise into the establishment that he went on to become a governor of the BBC. Mr. Morgan, who began as a lorry driver's mate, presented a sporty, high-tech image, and he made millions out of the promise that his company could dispose of industry's most troublesome and poisonous residues. This was their company promotional film.
When it comes to the disposal of dangerous chemicals, call in Pearl. A technical representative will take away a sample for analysis so that an efficient means of disposal can be determined. And remember, everyone has a responsibility to the community to ensure that waste is dealt with professionally and safely.
On the programme, one employee, a foreman, gave evidence to describe how company employees bribed council officials to turn a blind eye to illegal dumping. Another, a manager, took these photographs of how one of Britain's biggest waste handlers created a landscape of rusty barrels and polluted lagoons. The manager was so disturbed he told This Week about his own part in secret toxic dumping by Pearl.
And this is what we did, and we buried them in a trench running right the way across the middle of the tip.
Was it an authorised load?
No, not this particular substance.
What was it booked as, can you remember?
I don't think it was booked, actually.
You mean it...
No, there's no record of it.
The central piece of evidence was this Pearl internal document describing how drivers were paid to lose material.
Now, how do you interpret the phrase, with drivers paid to lose?
Well, first of all, I must say I've not seen this document before until you presented it to me. You know, it isn't too difficult to put that sort of comment on the bottom of a piece of paper, if these were the figures. I can't say any more.
We went to see what had happened 17 years on to some of Mr. Morgan's dumps in Wales. One was at Brefyscon Quarry just outside Cardiff. Here, rusty drums can still be spotted rising out of the ground at what should be a problem-free rural scene. But the National Rivers Authority list Brefyscon as one of 2 quarries filled with an unknown chemical cocktail, including PCBs. Even by the time the quarries were filled at the end of the 60s, they report, a noxious leachate was being produced. The operators abandoned the sites and took no further responsibility for them. Mindy is the second Welsh quarry with problems. Here, the local brooks have run foul for 20 years. Poisons and agents that can cause cancer, such as phenols, aniline and PCBs, are typical mixtures at these sites, and the Rivers Authority has continually to monitor and analyse the watercourses further off, for fear the pollution from the toxic dump will spread. Monitoring the water supply is an expensive business, but there's no alternative for public safety. Analysts from the Rivers Authority expect to be busy like this at public expense for many years to come. The Rivers Authority reports Mindy continues to discharge an offensive leachate to this day. A third Pearl site is causing the newest problems, another £1 million worth, here at Ticlwyd, high above the Sahawi Valley. Toxic leaks are springing out of the old sandstone quarry at the brow of the hill, down through the ground onto the track, the pasture land and behind the houses on the floor of the valley. Council consultants, a Liverpool University team, found poisons like phenol here, PCBs again, and a variety of chemical solvents. They reported the potential for large-scale pollution is enormous. Pontyfinnen Farm down the hill, where grazing land is polluted, has been the home for 50 years of Mr. Ivor Davis. Has he thought of seeking compensation?
Oh, if it was possible, but there on the other hand, who do you claim off? Because reading between the lines, those are stumped, it is more or less done a runner on it, haven't they?
Tony Morgan's legacy is now marked by seepage at the Ticlwyd dump site, where, once again, half-buried drums are evident. The present owner is legally liable, in theory, for all this debris, but can't pay for the massive walls and plastic covers required to seal the tip and make it safe. And as her lawyer explains, Jenny Thomas didn't know what she was buying.
We've had a look at the documentation, all the necessary searches were undertaken. It doesn't appear as though there's any way she could have known. Certainly the local search didn't reveal the toxic waste.
It's said it's going to cost more than £1 million to put this right. As the owner, is Mrs. Thomas in a position to pay for that?
No, quite clearly she's not.
Do you think somebody else must have to pay?
Well, somebody will have to pay somewhere along the line. Morally speaking, perhaps the people who dumped the toxic waste there in the first place should pay.
Isloyn Borough Council have offered to take over the dump, but Bob Cook, the council leader, doesn't see why they should carry the can.
As far as we know, Pearl Waste Disposal Company were the original people with the planning permission to tip there, although it was with a permission without toxic waste being tipped.
This waste was tipped without permission?
Toxic waste was tipped without permission, yeah.
Have you asked Pearl Waste if they're responsible for this?
Pearl Waste is a company that's no longer in existence, unfortunately, as such.
Do you know where the individuals who ran Pearl Waste are
No,
now?
I don't, but I would like to know.
We found the answer for Councillor Cook here, just west of Cardiff at Port Talbot. Since selling Pearl Waste, Tony Morgan now heads another company who are currently battling for consent to build a plant at nearby Ebwa Vale. His WizTech group want it to treat and transfer toxic waste. Tony Morgan himself refused our request for interview, We went to see him at his home in Buckinghamshire, but he wouldn't interrupt his morning jog to talk to us.
Mr. Morgan, do you accept any responsibility for the toxic waste?
Later, he returned by the back door.
I'm outside Mr. Morgan's Buckinghamshire house, and I'm now going to go in to try and continue our so far unsuccessful interview. Mr. Morgan appears to be in the house. He's telephoning. But he doesn't seem to be answering the door.
Mr. Morgan decided not to emerge at all and won't answer questions. We eventually received a letter in which Tony Morgan said, "There are no grounds for criticism of myself or WizTech, and I am not responsible as you seek to suggest." He added, "There is no evidence of any breach of planning consents." The controversy over dumping by Tony Morgan and others led to new laws in 1974 designed to change the dumping landscape. The Control of Pollution Act was supposed to bring in a brave new world of properly licensed landfills. Every tip was intended to be like this model council site at Arpley in Cheshire. Under this regime, toxic waste was to be supervised, analysed and dealt with safely.
Good afternoon.
But the 1974 Act was unsuccessful. Not everywhere were smoothly computerised controls to be found as they were at Arpley. This waste has been analysed by the site chemist and carefully logged. It's then put into its own clay-lined trench in measured quantities. District authorities everywhere were supposed to draw up master plans for waste disposal, both for their own and the private enterprise tips they supervised. But they failed to do so. The law was not enforced. 14 years after the Act was passed, Sir Hugh Ross's Environment Committee found a situation of neglect.
Some authorities were better than others, and some did place strict disciplines upon the waste disposers. Other authorities were very slack, and because of the slackness, it became cheap to dump in their areas. And of course, if someone's got something they want to get rid of, they don't want to pay over the odds, and it will go to one of the cheaper areas of the country. And this is really what my committee report was trying to do, to alert everybody to the neglect there has been from the public, the media, local government, central government, over many, many years. And I used the phrase at the time for which I was criticised, we are sitting literally on a time bomb.
We have identified for the first time all the 428 sites that have been licensed to take certain types of toxic waste in Britain. These are the ones that have emerged since the 1974 Act. Sir Hugh's warning is that we cannot guarantee how scrupulously all these sites have been managed. As recently as last year, for example, this landfill site near Wrexham was discovered to be taking in illegal consignments of toxic waste from Holland. They were intended to be covered over and hidden by the next morning. But HDV in Wales obtained these photographs. They showed sealed drums containing corrosive and toxic waste. As these pictures show, little seems to have changed in some ways from the old free-for-all dumping days. The head until recently of the government's Hazardous Waste Inspectorate was David Mills, who was responsible for trying to supervise toxic waste dumping. He resigned last year in frustration and has never before spoken out as he does tonight. But before he left, David Mills issued 3 harshly critical reports on the situation as he found it.
The principal findings then was that not so much that these sites were definitely presenting a threat to the environment, but that they were taking insufficient care to assure themselves of the nature of the waste they were receiving, and furthermore to monitor the behaviour of the landfill after the sites were in place.
As head of the Hazardous Waste Inspectorate, you wrote those 3 highly critical reports. Were your criticisms acted on?
No, frankly they weren't.
Did you become frustrated by the apparent inaction after writing these critical reports?
Yes, I did, and I, in fact, question whether or not a fourth report, which would have been bound to have presented more of the same, I had to question the value of such a report faced with continual lack of response by the legislators.
Mr. Chairman, conference.
But the nation's legislators are now suddenly being forced to sit up and take notice. This Conservative councillor is preparing an important speech for the recent Tory party conference.
As a councillor, I represent and live in Aldridge Brown Hills, part of Walsall in the West Midlands, right next to the largest hazardous waste disposal site in the country. We don't have the luxury of saying not in my backyard. It is not only in our backyard, but beneath the houses in which we live.
Councillor Mavis Foden from Walsall is trying to carry the fears of her constituents into the heart of the newly green Tory administration. She and her neighbours live next to a controversial waste company. She told the conference how they had dumped millions of gallons of toxic material close to and even underneath their homes in pits and old mine workings.
Hear the voice of the vulnerable people of the West Midlands. I support the motion before conference.
Her message to the conference was that her constituents had fears about their health.
They do want to know if it is possible that these symptoms of respiratory diseases, leukemia, bowel and stomach upsets, streaming eyes, the mysterious viruses that we all seem to get on various occasions are connected in some way to toxic waste.
The focus of all the fear in Walsall is this site, one of Britain's biggest toxic waste plants. It is run by a company called Lee Environmental. The local residents have been turning out regularly for months to picket the gates, whatever the weather.
Why are you standing here in the rain?
Well, it's not for my health, for the kiddies' sake, and their kiddies, because there's a time bomb down there. Not in my time, perhaps not in your time, but it'll come sooner or later.
Well, there's organic and inorganic waste there. There's cyanide, heavy metals, everything. Cadmium, mercury. They're putting anything in there, and they're allowed to.
What do you want to happen to this plant?
I want it closed and made safe.
The company is filling 3 enormous clay holes with toxic liquid. They use a special scientific process called Sealer Safe to make it set hard, as Lee tells its potential customers in this video.
And that's what I'm standing on now. Over 2 million tons of industry's rather nastier byproducts. Treated by Lee, of course, and I'd hardly be standing here if it wasn't entirely safe. A 2-part chemical process converts toxic materials into an insoluble, non-toxic form. And this polymer is the end result. It's impermeable, non-leaching, and can be landfilled with perfect safety.
Lee's polymer may set hard in the hand, but in the clay pits there's a problem. This black toxic slurry, which has been there for years, simply hasn't set. The company threatened us with an injunction if we showed this official film of scientists from the government laboratories at Harwell. They're taking samples after a council inspector put his foot through the crust. Samples of all sorts of different consistencies were found. These Harwell samples are being studied by the council, who have to ensure the site's safety. They've refused permission for the process to continue.
You can see it's still quite damp. Perhaps you'd like me to tip one out for you?
Yes, please. Yeah. The original Sealer Safe patent boasted that this material set hard enough to use as aggregate for road building.
It's a bit messy, isn't it?
It is a bit messy. It holds its shape quite well. Rather like a jelly.
Yes, yes.
Chief Environmental Health Officer Jeff Kirkham is alarmed by its consistency. There is more than 1 million tons of such unattractive material buried in these pits. The company refuses to be interviewed, but they say the clay holes themselves will now contain the liquid and they'll all be reclaimed. But Jeff Kirkham says the pits simply cannot be left as they are.
The two major problems would result from that. The first would be a danger of water pollution, in that if water gains access, it could overtop, and contaminated liquors, leachate, could then flow into watercourses. The second problem is one of site stability, due to the fluid characteristics of the material or the major part of the material in the site. And we have to be absolutely sure that the site is stable when it's finally reclaimed.
Do you regard this massive hole in the ground as environmentally safe at the moment?
At the moment, I would say no.
But there's another problem. The local residents' homes sit above miles of old coal mines. The company's been pouring waste down those too. They say the waste is safely contained because the unusual clay geology of the area prevents any leaks from the workings beneath their site. Lee are using 12 miles of these workings. Down boreholes they've poured millions of gallons of liquid waste, and now the company wants to pour more poisons down the old mines by sinking yet another borehole. But the council fear that when they do this they'll enter old mine workings which have previously been blocked. We have learned these workings are flooded, yet at the original public inquiry a key safety point was that they were dry. This very danger was raised then, 11 years ago, by geologist Colin Phipps.
Said that it was not possible to be certain that this particular mine would be sealed off from either subsurface or surface waters. It seemed to me quite clear. I wasn't able to say that when it would happen. In fact, it's probably happened rather more rapidly than I might have predicted. But the fact is, it has happened and will happen in the future. And if water can get in, it can also get out.
What are the dangers that the people around there actually face to themselves if something goes wrong with the waste that's being tipped down there, or new waste in the future?
One of the real problems that one has with old mine workings, with collapse and the injection of material, in fact, alters the pressure balance underground and may actually lead to collapse. That can release fumes, water, all sorts of problems, quite apart from the general problem that all of the local water, surface water, is likely to get contaminated over a period of time.
A health monitoring van is now trawling the streets around the Lee site. It is the first of its kind in the country and is part of a major health survey now underway in Walsall. The pollution detector van is sifting the dust and air, searching for clues about the way the poisons of the past may be coming back to haunt us, our children, and even their children yet unborn. Next week, in part 2 of our investigation, we show how mishandling of such waste may have brought us a new disease that nearly killed this little boy. He was saved by brain surgery at 3 weeks old. Today he's well, but other children have died. The full story next Thursday. Green and pleasant land is seeping toxic pollution, and how neglected dangers are costing us millions to make safe and maybe bringing us a new disease, one which turns mother's milk into baby's poisons. These men are facing danger, and it's danger from a man-made chemical. PCBs are what's coming out of here, polychlorinated biphenyls. They're so dangerous that to drain them out of an obsolete piece of electrical equipment last week, these German specialists had to wear respirators and special protection and seal the chemicals in triple drums to be burned in a furnace. They take these precautions because PCBs, when they escape, don't decay like ordinary things. They last indefinitely in the environment, and along with their byproducts, they're unpredictable and poisonous. We reveal tonight how in Britain in the past we've all too often just dumped PCBs in some disturbing places so they can seep out into a country lane and into the food chain. Such poisons can affect people. This is an X-ray showing massive unexplained bleeding inside a 3-week-old baby's skull. This little boy is well now, but only after a major operation for his mystery disease.
We were afraid he was going to die, of course, yeah. But they said in the best case, if he survives, he will be mentally handicapped and physically handicapped. And we should be glad if that would be the case. So we accepted it.
But there was yet another shock to come for little Reuben's mother.
When he was home for about 1 week, I was just going to breastfeed him, and then the phone went, and then someone said, "Hello, I'm a doctor, and can I get a sample of your breast milk?" I said, why would you have that? And I thought first it was for newborn babies whose mother couldn't feed them. I said, well, I suspect that it has your son's disease has to do with PCB contamination.
I think that almost every woman that's, especially when she's a little older, has these chemicals in her adipose tissue, in her fat. And when you have it in your fat, it's coming in your breast milk.
Tonight we'll disclose the detective story that will lead us from this container of PCBs back to baby Reuben. But there's one question to be answered first. Who's to blame for creating these toxic chemicals? They were invented in the 1920s by the chemical industries of the West. They cooked together ordinary oils with the poisonous gas chlorine to make a new miracle liquid. One of the market leaders was the giant American Monsanto company. They pumped out the entire British supply of PCBs from this plant at Newport in South Wales. We asked one of their directors whether Monsanto had known what it was doing.
Certainly we didn't know, otherwise we wouldn't have manufactured them and marketed them in the first place.
Why didn't you know at the time that they were toxic or environmentally hazardous?
Well, of course, we're, I think, judging yesterday's operations by today's standards. And in those days, it would have been very difficult to simulate anything which could have foreseen those effects. And, of course, the analytical techniques just weren't available to measure the very minute traces that we're now talking about.
The miracle chemical had a cascade of uses. It was sticky, good for kiss-proof lipstick, ideal for household paint, and in the office for carbonless copy paper. It also went into printing ink. PCBs resisted electricity, handy for fluorescent light capacitors, and most of all for electrical transformers. There's one in most office blocks, billed as the cooling fluid that didn't catch fire. Then came disaster signs. They led to the eventual banning of the miracle chemical by the end of the 70s. Dying animals like this seal alerted scientists in the 60s to the way PCBs were continually piling up in the food chain. 12,000 birds in the Irish Sea perished in 1969. PCBs were discovered in their tissues. It was the same story when chickens stopped laying after eating contaminated food in the US in 1971. In Japan and Taiwan, blistered hands and discolored skin were the mark of mass poisonings in 1968 and again in 79. Cooking oil had been accidentally tainted with PCBs.
Well, when we started manufacture, we were not aware of the potential threat to the environment that we realized they presented early in the 1970s, and we voluntarily stopped manufacture in fact, 1977.
But stopping manufacture for transformers and general use didn't solve the problem of what to do with the PCBs that had been already manufactured. It was all very well to label PCBs with a skull and crossbones and take them away, but it's hard to dispose of such a persistent chemical without using extreme methods. More than 1 million tons of PCBs have been manufactured. Only 4% has been finally got rid of by burning in special and costly furnaces. 30% has already escaped into the world beyond recall. Half the world's total is now lying buried in rubbish dumps, and the remainder is still in active use, mainly in elderly transformers. That makes a total of around 66% of the world's PCBs still waiting to escape.
Now, if any substantial proportion of that 65% of the remaining PCBs enters the environment, then we're looking at an environmental catastrophe on a global scale.
An environmental catastrophe, that's a strong way of putting it.
It's not an entirely unjustified way of putting it. We're already beginning to find these residues being transported all over the globe. We're beginning to find these residues turning up in open ocean sea mammals. It really is a very, very big problem indeed, and we cannot afford to let it get any bigger.
PCBs are escaping all round Britain's coasts. First, the North Sea. The Piper Alpha oil rig last year still had PCB-filled transformers on board out in the North Sea off Aberdeen. The Occidental Oil Company admit they thought about replacing them in 1986 with something safer, but they decided against it. On the night of July 6, the oil rig blew up. Occidental's optimism had been misplaced. Preliminary government surveys have already detected telltale hotspots of PCBs under the wreckage in the North Sea.
The 5 tons of PCBs in the transformer on that oil rig seem to have gone to the bottom of the ocean. What we haven't seen are the results of the government's monitoring. Now, there may be a very serious long-term pollution hazard because the 5 tons on the Piper Alpha are significantly more in one place than is discharged by all of the rivers feeding into the North Sea in a year.
Another place PCBs are escaping is on Merseyside. The BICC plant at Helsby. They used to have a capacitor factory here. Now they've got an alarming pollution problem instead. Their ground is contaminated with PCBs. The company only discovered the contamination when they planned to rebuild. So now they're engaged in a highly expensive operation to try and contain the leaks and cover the whole site with a waterproof plastic sheet. BICC's been leaking PCBs wholesale. Their manager describes the size of the problem.
When we took the readings across the site and realised we had the PCBs, we then went outside the site and checked down the streams and found we had PCB contamination in the sediment.
But they have been leaking without anyone's knowledge, as it were, for up to 20 years.
Well, I think it's true that we weren't aware that there were PCBs leaking down the streams, and we took those readings. It's quite true.
And there was also PCB contamination found in the cattle that had been grazing on the land nearby, I believe.
Again, that's true. The land outside the site has been used off and on over the years for the grazing of cattle. We went as far as slaughtering some of these cattle to check the PCBs in the fat and the tissues. Some PCBs were found at very low levels. Those results have been passed on to the Environmental Health Office and to the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, and they've accepted that those results are okay and the cattle carry on grazing.
There's one problem plastic sheets won't solve, however. The company also dumped waste 20 years ago onto a nearby tip. PCBs are now leaking from that tip into a watercourse in substantial quantities, as local residents at Alvanley have discovered.
Yep, yes, quite strong, hasn't it?
Last week we revealed that the local Vale Royal Council are doing nothing so far to stop it. But will the company?
I certainly believe that we're responsible for the BICC capacitors on the site, so the share of that PCB has to be BICC's, and we would talk to Vale Royal at the right time about that subject.
The next PCB escape route, the Severn Estuary. We're back at Monsanto, the original source of all Britain's and much of America's PCBs. Here it's just water from tank cleaning that's harmlessly overflowing into the Monsanto drains. But the company's underground drainage system has also been collecting residues from the past when they used to make PCBs on the plant. For years now, PCBs have been getting into the main effluent pipe. The pipe runs out to sea from the edge of the plant, dumping PCBs right into the open water.
Well, most of it is staying in the ground, in fact, and therefore it's contained. Some, of course, does get into the effluent, which in fact is discharged into the Severn Estuary. But again, we're talking about very minute quantities and well within the permitted levels that we're allowed to discharge.
Are you going to try and do anything to stop these discharges into the Severn Estuary?
Oh, yes, obviously, but clearly what we have to do is to find the right technique to do this. As I said, we're talking about very small quantities. Those are not easy to get rid of, and we want to make sure that we come up with the best solution to that problem.
Monsanto also dumped its waste in these Welsh tips. As we revealed last week, Brafiscan Quarry has been leaking PCBs from old drums. So has Mindy Quarry, which is still leaking PCBs. Here the brooks have run foul for 20 years with the substance. And at a third old quarry at Ticlwyd, PCB waste is now seeping out over the valley side. It'll cost £1 million to make safe. The operator of these dumps was known as the Elegant Muck Shifter, businessman Tony Morgan of Pearl Waste. On last week's programme, we reported how Mr. Morgan has now sold Pearl Waste, a company which caused controversy for their disposal methods in the 70s. Tony Morgan said he refused to accept any responsibility for the state of the tips. Companies like Monsanto and BICC take a more public-spirited view themselves. Monsanto are now happy to show how carefully they handle their modern waste. The chemical companies expect tighter laws soon, making producers liable for toxic waste. Monsanto know they must now face up to their PCB problems.
Clearly, we were the people who made the products which produced the contamination, which ultimately was deposited on these various landfill sites in South Wales. So yes, we do share a responsibility for that situation.
And the next PCB escape takes us to the English Channel. We can reveal that the British government was to blame here for one of the worst PCB safety scandals, a story which has been hushed up for a decade. Now forgotten, there was a previous official plan to build a Channel tunnel in 1974. The plan ran out of money. Left underground down the shaft when work stopped was the old tunnelling machine. Its transformer contained 200 gallons of toxic PCBs. The Department of Transport had a problem to solve, which they did in a way worthy of a visit to the cinema. They did it on the cheap. The department accepted £19,000 from an East End scrap merchant to take their junk away. By accident or design, the PCBs in the transformer were poured onto the ground. They contaminated 1,500 tons of seaside chalk. The scrap merchant vanished with the rest of the metal, and so began an undignified Whitehall farce. The men from the ministry had to confront the PCB crisis on Shakespeare Cliff. PCBs had recently been declared a major hazard. The government chemist told them in a secret report to take the dangerous stuff away, which would have been expensive. The men from the ministry mused, took a look and decided on an altogether different course of action. And so they did, and they hoped it would be forgotten about, but a brand new channel scheme began. But the contractors wouldn't work on a contaminated site. Back they came. They still couldn't bear to spend the money. They wanted to cover the PCBs with concrete. Their own inspector ordered them to dig up the soil. So they took 27 tons of highly toxic PCBs to tip into a council refuse dump in Kent. Tipping it was really cheap and the ministry men were happy. But this dumping broke official regulations. So the inspector made them dig it up again. What do you do with 1,000 1,000 drums of toxic waste and nowhere to put it. They didn't have a licensed storage site, of course. They had an ordnance base in Herefordshire, but it got rid of the stuff. It took 9 years for the PCBs to be properly incinerated. Quite a farce, but it isn't all that funny when you think about it. At least the present Transport Secretary, Cecil Parkinson, doesn't think so. He's ordered an urgent inquiry into our discoveries, and the cost to the taxpayer of this dangerous production are wasted £2.25 million. Behind this fiasco and others like it lies in fact a tragedy. Indestructible PCBs are leaking into the environment, and they're contaminating almost every corner of our planet. Even remote oceans and animals pick up the contamination, as each of the various acts of ignorance or recklessness we've catalogued releases yet another quantity of PCBs to percolate through the seas and through the food chain.
They're turning up in the Arctic, they're turning up in the Antarctic, they're transported by the winds, they're transported in the rain. They get into the food quite simply because PCBs, if you start with a very low concentration and it is ingested by one animal, you get a magnification effect of up to 100 times. So that by the time it's gone through 3 steps in the food chain, you're talking about several 100,000 times magnification.
That magnification works like this. The ocean acts as a sink. Hosts of small sea creatures then hoover up the PCBs, and so they collect in their bodies. Fish eat nothing but these PCB-rich organisms, and so PCBs accumulate inside them. By the time quantities of fish are eaten in turn by seals and others at the top of the food chain like people, the total PCB level is thousands of times higher. Dead seals appeared in the Mersey last year, grossly polluted with PCBs. But there are even more worrying consequences for human beings.
And we find that the greatest and most dangerous effects are exerted on unborn children and on newly born children who are receiving PCBs through their mother's breast milk. We find that these children have a diminished learning ability over their peers, or if they're exposed in utero, they tend to be born at an earlier developmental stage than their peers. And of course, that sort of modification to the life cycle is something that we need to take very, very seriously indeed.
He's a hungry boy, isn't he? He's a heavy one. Come on, then.
Breastfed babies, then, can't help taking in PCBs with their mother's milk. And it is among such babies that signs of a strange new disease have been appearing. Among the first to spot it in 1983 was this Devon consultant, John Tripp, at the Royal Devon and Exeter hospitals. The problem is a failure of the blood clotting mechanism in breastfed babies. It's called late hemorrhagic disease.
We had a number of babies presenting with hemorrhagic disease rather later than we usually see, between the ages of 5 weeks and 12 weeks, in 1983, born in this area.
But is there any confirmation of this disease from other parts of the world?
There have been a number of reports from this country, from the States and from Japan, of late-onset hemorrhagic disease, so that it does exist worldwide as a condition.
The next chapter in the detective story moves to a university hospital in Holland. There, Professor Jana Kopper, head of the neonatology department at Amsterdam University, puzzled over the sick baby she too was seeing. It was clear that the breastfed babies were bleeding like haemophiliacs because they had somehow developed a crucial shortage of vitamin K.
And it's very unusual that babies that are normally born and are normally breastfed, that they should have such a serious disease. I mean, if there isn't any cause for it, just a shortness of vitamin K, that's very unlikely. Because you don't need that much vitamin K. It can be recycled normally in your liver. And so only small amounts are necessary.
Professor Copper discovered last year a pathway by which the transfer of PCBs from mother's breast milk could interfere with the normal action of enzymes which go to work in the newborn baby's liver.
Those enzymes are stimulated in the liver to detoxify, so to get rid of PCBs. But when these enzymes try to do that, they think that vitamin K is a poison as well, and that's probably the reason why it's metabolized, and the baby has a shortness of vitamin K. And vitamin K is absolutely necessary for clotting.
So the PCBs pass from the mother into the mother's breast milk, into the baby's liver.
Yes.
And there, when the liver tries to get rid of it, it destroys vitamin K as well.
Yeah, that's the idea.
And it's the lack of vitamin K which makes the babies ill.
Yes.
Little is still known about PCB behaviour. Last July, Professor Copper published her findings in England, where they're being studied by her colleagues.
Well, I've had a look at Professor Copper's paper, and I certainly would think that, as she says, it's a plausible hypothesis. It would certainly be a reasonable thing to investigate the possibility that contaminants in our environment affect the way in which vitamin K is used in the body.
Baby of Gillian River. Okay. Right, now this isn't going to hurt him, all right? You might shout.
Fortunately, there's a straightforward answer for worried mothers. Ted Rivers is 1.5 hours old. Here at Exeter, it's now policy to give newborn babies a booster injection of vitamin K straight away.
That's a good boy. There, all finished.
And no one advises that breastfeeding of babies should yet be stopped.
We strongly encourage breastfeeding for babies because it has many advantages. These are significant in this country, but even more significant in third world countries. And more than 70% of the babies from this unit go home breastfeeding.
There's no getting away from the fact, however, that an artificial chemical with effects that are only patchily understood has contaminated women against their will and without their knowledge. Recent figures show PCBs in breast milk fat everywhere. The third world, such as Thailand, has low levels. In the US, levels are 3 times higher. Western Europe is the highest of all, up to 762 parts per billion. But in Britain, where levels of 500 were detected a decade ago, there are no reliable up-to-date figures.
We are concerned that the World Health Organization, in studies of human breast milk in a European context, have discovered high levels of PCB. And they say that although breastfeeding should continue, the safety margin is very low. We want to see effective action by government to prevent any further environmental contamination with PCBs. They get into the environment, they get into our food, and they end up in human breast milk.
But surely if PCBs have got into the environment, there's nothing we can do about it now.
All electrical equipment containing PCBs must be, in effect, put under guard. In other words, we need a sort of a security-minded approach to the management of PCBs, to identify the waste and make sure that no sort of fly-by-night scrap metal operator whisks away some transformers to get the scrap metal and dumps the PCBs to contaminate the environment.
This chemical should almost certainly have never been invented, but the world is stuck with its consequences now. Yet we're still careless. This is just a brief list of some of the accidents involving PCBs that have been collected in recent years and published by the World Health Organization. It shows that from Stockholm to New York, in office blocks, railway yards and factories, PCB equipment is exploding, leaking and catching fire. Little Ruben was one of the sufferers from the disease that Professor Copper researched. He's well and happy now, but it was an experience that will live with his mother, Dutch schoolteacher Marlene Helleman, for a long time.
They had to take blood from his hands, and they couldn't do it because he bled so much, and they couldn't stop the bleeding. They cut his head open, they pushed his brain tissue aside, and they tried to take out as much blood as was possible.
How does it make you feel about these substances contaminating?
Very angry, yeah.
Do you feel anything can be done or should be done?
You know, something should be done. And, well, I think it can be done. But it's already got very far here in Holland, I think.
And very far in the rest of the world, as dead seals off the British coast bear witness. It's clear we must be more vigilant about PCBs, or the price for past neglect may have to be paid by tomorrow's generation.